На главном корпусе, третий, четвертый, между третьим и четвертым.
А там люди есть?
Да,
Поднимай над состав.
поднимаю, начальника поднял.
Так всех, весь офицерский состав, офицерский корпус поднимай.
Леонид Алексеевич.
Да.
Алло, Припять, третий и четвертый блок горит крыша в результате аварии взрыва.
Увидел, давай. Так уже подтвердили?
Не подтвердили, авария там произошла у них. Это диспетчер Припяти сказала.
Пожарная охрана.
Алло, Иванков?
Да.
Значит, вы выезжаете в Припять? Алло?
Да, я слышу.
На атомную станцию выезжайте. Там третий и четвертый блок горит крыша.
Пожарная охрана.
Алло, Полесская?
Да.
Вы, значит, выезжаете на атомную станцию, там горит крыша третьего и четвертого блока.
Привет, бratья. Today, we are looking at the Chernobyl disaster, the initial meltdown, the response effort, and the aftermath of the disaster. First things first, however. Let's go back to where it all began. The initial construction of the Chernobyl NPP. 1972, when talks began in Kiev about what kind of nuclear power plant was going to be built in Chernobyl. Bukhanov suggested that they used pressurized water reactors, as they were deemed safer than RBMK reactors. However, scientist Alexandrov opposed this and said that the RBMK reactors were not only the safest reactors, but also produced the cheapest energy as well. Weighing the two options, the Ukrainian Minister of Energy, Alexei Mukin, decided that the latter option would be implemented. 4 years after the partial meltdown of reactor number 2, a journalist from the Pripyat newspaper by the name of Miss Lyubov Kovalevskaya manages to obtain secret documents that show some of the deep-lying faults in the construction of the Chernobyl NPP. She cited that subpar construction, subpar concrete, thefts, and bureaucratic incompetence are creating a bomb. Quote, "The failures here will be repaid over the decades to come." In hindsight, Kovalevskaya's article was prophetic, as a mere 4 months later, the Chernobyl disaster occurs. April 25th, 1986, 1 a.m. The scientists at Chernobyl wished to try out a new method of cooling off the reactor core and begin to experiment with various forms of power usage. This experiment goes on for 12 hours. At 2 p.m., the tests were supposed to end with the reactor running at 30% capacity. However, the Soviet government demanded that the reactor was to be kept running at 50% to provide power somewhere else. And so, the reactor is left running at 50% for 9 hours, with the emergency core cooling systems turned off. April 26th, 1:23 a.m. The reactor begins to rumble as the core begins to go critical. The cooling systems have failed, and an explosion is heard coming from the core. Staff Chief Asimov is confused and panicked as panels show that the cooling pumps are offline and that the reactor is receiving no water flow. 4 seconds later, the reactor explodes as the reactor reaches 120 times its full power. All the radioactive fuel for the reactor disintegrates, and excess steam used for the turbines cause all the pressure tubes to explode. The reactor cover is blown off, and radioactive material spews into the air. With the lid blown away, oxygen seeps into the reactor, reacting with the fuel and causing a graphite fire. As fire alarms blare, Asimov calls local emergency services to help combat the fires. At 1:35 a.m., the first firefighters arrive and start to hose down the roof of the blown reactor in order to combat the flames. Many of these firefighters would not survive the ordeal, as the amount of radiation emitted from the plant was enough to cripple a person in a matter of minutes. Gregory Camille, the driver of one of the fire engines, would later describe what happened. We arrived there at 10 or 15 minutes to 2 in the morning. We saw graphite scattered about. Misha asked, "Is that graphite?" I kicked it away, but one of the fighters on the other truck picked it up. "It's hot," he said. The pieces of graphite were of different sizes, some big, some small enough to pick them up. We didn't know much about radiation. Even those who worked there had no idea. There was no water left in the trucks. Misha filled a cistern, and we aimed the water at the top. Then those boys who died went up to the roof. Vashuk, Kolya, and others, and Volodya Pravik. They went up to the ladder, and I never saw them again. It took firefighters 5 hours and 9 minutes to extinguish all of the fires, save for the fire in Reactor 4, which was still burning, but unreachable. 2 firefighters would die that night, and 28 more firefighters would die in the following months due to radiation. It may have cost the lives of 30 firefighters, but the fires were extinguished. But the work of brave souls is never done, as extinguishing the fires was the easy part. After the fires were extinguished, the Soviet Union sets its sights on Chernobyl. Gorbachev gives the OK to wage total war on Chernobyl, a massive operation consisting of around 830,000 soldiers, volunteers, and prisoners. These people would be called liquidators, the men whose task was to clean and contain Chernobyl. Millions of lives would depend on these men to contain the radiation of Chernobyl. Thousands of men would die trying to contain it. These men would work 24/7, no breaks, no holidays, just clean up. The constant work of the liquidators would unfortunately result in the men being exposed to radiation 24/7 as well. As a result, 20% of those 830,000 military-aged men around the age of 18 to 22 years old would die in their 30s and 40s. Out of those liquidators still alive, 90% would face crippling health problems like that of heart disease, leukemia, and a whole host of cancers. Today, liquidators are the highest risk group for both their health and the health of their children. Whilst the liquidators handled the majority of the cleanup above ground, a deeper, more insidious threat lurked in the hollowed bowels of the Chernobyl NPP. During the meltdown, 3 divers, Alexeyenko, Valery Bezpalov, and Boris Baranov. These 3 men would be given a task so dangerous that it was thought to be suicidal. The task of these 3 divers was to dive into the radioactive cooling pool in order to drain the pool of water, as such to avoid a massive nuclear explosion that would have had the potential to completely raze the area around Chernobyl and rendering much of Europe radioactive. Through the actions of these 3 men, millions of lives would be saved. Unfortunately for these heroes, none of them would survive. Within a matter of weeks, all 3 of these men would die of radiation poisoning. All 3 of these men would be buried in Moscow in lead-lined coffins. Today, you can find monuments to these men and other liquidators scattered about Chernobyl. However, there is a silver lining to this tragic tale. With the covering of Reactor 2 and Reactor 4, in a rubber and concrete sarcophagus. The Chernobyl exclusion zone has been officially designated as a natural park. Now, how could this be? Surely the horrendous amounts of radiation of the plant would kill the majority of life in the area. Well, the thing about radiation is that radiation does not stick around for very long. Radiation is very unstable, and as such, the levels of radiation around Chernobyl and Pripyat are now nowhere near the levels they used to be. However, the land will still be uninhabitable for hundreds of years, at least for humans. With the absence of humanity in the area, local wildlife began to take back the area of Pripyat and Chernobyl. This gave rise to many endangered species, such as Przalski's horse, the European brown bear, and the European lynx. So in a way, the Chernobyl disaster was the best thing to happen in the area's ecosystem in a very, very long time. And whilst some go to Chernobyl to see the animals, many others are urban explorers that come to see the abandoned places of Pripyat and Chernobyl. Thus many of these urban explorers follow the tour guides and stick to the designated safe zones. Some go a bit further. Stalkers are people in the Chernobyl exclusion zone illegally. Originally, stalkers were outlaws and criminals hiding from the law. Nowadays, many of these stalkers are just young people from Ukraine that go to the exclusion zone for a sense of adventure or just to get away from the world. Quote, "It's a quiet place. You can think about everything and whatever problems you have don't seem that important." Quote, Oleg Shalaslav, a young stalker from Ukraine. Many of these young people are fans of the Stalker games, which are in turn inspired from the 1971 Soviet sci-fi book, A Roadside Picnic by Arkady and Boris Strugatsky. Stalkers love to go into the deeper parts of the zone, to go into the forests and abandoned blockhouse apartments that under normal circumstances you wouldn't be allowed to visit due to safety concerns. Given all of this, it's not hard to see why Chernobyl today is still a heated topic of discussion. To some, Chernobyl is a place of lead-lined memorial, a place to be left behind and buried. To others, Chernobyl is a great tourist attraction for post-apocalyptic romantics and disaster tourists. Whatever happens to Chernobyl in the future, one thing is for certain. The story of Chernobyl is one of legend, an epic tale of sacrifice, bravery, and incompetence that will forever shape the way people look at power, and a somber reminder that sometimes the power we harness might not be ready to be harnessed.